All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Ricky. So you get kind of a tag team today. You're gonna get I'm gonna talk about RCKMS. This is Natalie, and we also have Anne on, who's gonna talk a little bit more on the ECR side. Um, we pulled slides together. We have used a lot of these slides in other presentations that we've given, so don't be surprised if they are not super cohesive in the formatting, but we tried our best. Okay. So let's start with what is RCKMS? It's a long acronym, and it stands for the Reportable Conditions Knowledge Management System. The system can be thought of as a repository of public health reporting requirements for both reportable and the nationally notifiable conditions, and it provides decision support to report cases back to the jurisdictions. It is an integral part of the National Electronic Case Reporting System, the ECR system. And so this slide shows kind of the high level ECR process. So it all starts at a healthcare organization. Information gets entered into an EHR. The codes that are used to represent that information in the EHR get compared to codes in the RCTC, the reportable conditions trigger codes, and we'll talk more about that. If there is a match, an electronic initial case report, an EICR, gets triggered and sent to the RCKMS Decision Support Service. There at RCKMS, the EICR gets compared against the reporting criteria. Those have been authored by the jurisdictions in the RCKMS Knowledge Repository. And then RCKMS will determine reportability of the EICR. It can be reportable to one or more public health agency or to none. It will send a reportability response back to the provider and also send that same RR to the public health agencies if it's found reportable. This is just kind of another way to visualize that whole process. Here, what I wanted to really highlight, though, is that RCKMS is supported by both APHL and by CSTE. So the actual RCKMS system gets hosted on AIMS. APHL oversees the technical support work and really like the larger ECR activities. That's all run by APHL. CSTE oversees the content development for what gets put into RCKMS in the knowledge repository. They also provide authoring support for the jurisdictions and also develop the trainings for the end users. So on RCKMS, I work on this project under CSTE as part of content development and works on this project under APHL as part of ECR support, but we all work very closely together. And I'm going to pass it on to Ann for this one.
Yeah, so I thought it might be helpful. So as part of RCKMS, obviously it's a lot of data that has to flow through it. So on the left side here, we have kind of the number of healthcare organizations that were live in September of 2020. And those were at that time really only triggering on COVID only. So same number of facilities, but just a smaller amount of data flying through the system just because we're looking at a smaller subset of triggers for one condition. You fast forward almost 5 full years, and that's gone up to almost 57,000. We're probably a little bit higher than that at this point. Facilities that are now doing triggering for all conditions for electronic case reporting. So we're seeing probably over 1 million messages per day being sent and using RCKMS for decision support. So I'll pass it back to you, Natalie.
That's a lot of EICRs. Okay, so diving in a little bit into what we do on the CSTE side with content development. We develop the content for each condition. So the conditions that are included in our CKMS, they have clinical, laboratory, other evidence that get used as the basis of determining whether the case should be reported to public health. And I think it's important to note, and I'm trying to do that on the slide here, that RCKMS is intended to be utilized for case ascertainment for a condition. So it's meant to capture any EICRs that meet criteria for what a provider is legally required to report to public health. And these RCKMS reporting criteria, they're based on case ascertainment criteria from the position statements, the CSE position statements, if those are available for a condition. The difference between case ascertainment and case classification is important. The case classification, you might hear that referred to as the case definition. There's also often a lot of overlap, but ascertainment describes what should be reported to public health. It's the potential case. That's what we're covering in EICRs. Case definition classification describes how to classify that potential case. That happens at the PHA. They determine if it's confirmed probable suspect, not a case. That's what we're used to seeing in like a case notification message that gets sent to CDC under NNDSS-TA. And one other thing to note, currently RCKMS only covers provider reporting. So conditions and associated criteria reportable to a jurisdiction from a provider. And those are based on what's included in their state reporting regulations. So what we build is a reporting specification in RS. It's a Word document. They get developed as a Word document and then passed over to the RCKMS system technical team to be implemented within the tool. I think as of the last release, we have 260 conditions. I think 260 conditions available in RCKMS. We have 2 content releases scheduled a year. And then we have off-schedule releases that happen sometimes, usually for like emergent things. We had them a lot during COVID response, MPOX, things like that. So emergency situations typically. And I wanted to walk through a couple of the pieces of the reporting specs so you can get an idea of what's in here. So this is the snapshot of a logic table, and this includes criteria for conditions and how those criteria fit together to form a logic set. So the criteria are listed on the left side of the table with the various logic sets on the right. So a criterion would be hepatitis A as a diagnosis or active problem. It's highlighted there in orange. And then the logic sets get categorized by their type. So lab, diagnosis, epi, etc. The logic sets are built using the S, N, and O designations, the notations. They're the same ones that are found in the CSTE position statements. If you've ever looked at those, S is sufficient, N is necessary, O is one or more / optional, depending on where you look. We can talk more about that if you're interested. They look a little scary, but they're like actually super simple once you start, looking at them all the time. And then in that snapshot of logic table that we're looking at, you'll also see that the logic sets, they're specific to provider facility reporting. So again, that's the focus of ECR RCKMS. But you also see that we have some in there for lab reporting and for vital records. So those are included just for informational purposes. Those do not get evaluated by the RCKMS tool, at least at this point. Okay, so then we move on to kind of our second section of the reporting spec. It's the value sets required table. The value sets are used to operationalize the criteria from the snapshot of logic table. They are shown here in the value sets required table. In this example, we're still working on hepatitis A. That diagnosis criterion that we saw on the last slide gets represented here by 2 value sets, one for SNOMED CT codes and one that has ICD-10-CM codes. Depending on the criteria that we're trying to operationalize, we'll use a combination of trigger value sets and common value sets. The trigger value sets contain codes that represent diagnoses, lab tests, lab results that are specific to the condition, so specific to hepatitis A in this example. Whereas the common value sets contain codes that represent same things, diagnoses, lab tests, lab results, but they are not specific to the condition. And those value sets can be used across various conditions. And then they end up getting paired with a trigger value set in our logic rules. As you can see from these examples, RCKMS criteria and logic rules, they rely heavily on these coded concepts, and the coded concepts get represented by value sets. Very something near and dear to our hearts, right? Okay, so then our final section here is the default and optional logic section. This is where we combine those criteria and the logic sets from that first table, the snapshot of logic, with the value sets from the value sets required table. We're using the same example again here, hepatitis A, default logic rule 1, we use the SNOMED CT and the ICD-10 value sets to represent Hep A as a diagnosis or active problem, and we build it in here using logic statements that can then be implemented within the RCKMS tool. Not to belabor the point, but just pull it all together. We start with the criteria and the logic sets in the snapshot of logic table. Those get represented by value sets in the value set table. Those get operationalized using logic statements in the default and optional logic section. And this is a Word doc, so this is very similar to what the jurisdiction users see in the RCKMS tool, but it's also nice they can download this, they can share it with their colleagues, their EPI-SMEs, they can be marking things up in a Word document, which can be nice for implementation. Okay, I figured since we are on the vocab call, maybe we want to talk a little bit about the value sets. So we have two value set types. I mentioned this already, but we have trigger and common value sets. About 70% of our value sets in RCKMS are trigger value sets, and so those are the condition-specific ones. The codes from those value sets are the basis of the RCTC. The remaining 30% are not condition-specific value sets. Those are our common value sets. Those still get used in the tool. They're used in decision logic. They can be used across multiple conditions to determine reportability, but they are not going to be in the RCTC. So if you download a version of the RCTC, you are only going to see the trigger codes, only the condition-specific codes. We have a lot of other value sets that might be useful to you that are common for cough and fever and diarrhea and all sorts of different things. Tests for organisms, whatever. Lots of common value sets as well, and those are not in the RCTC. Speaking of the RCTC, this slide provides information about the reportable condition trigger codes, RCTC. This gets distributed to EHR implementers via the ERSD service, and a new version of the RCTC becomes available at every scheduled content release. And if we have an off-schedule release, we typically have a new RCTC as well, because oftentimes we are having that off-schedule release, emergent release, because we have new codes available during an emergency. I have the code systems that are included in the RCTC here. So we've got SNOMED, ICD-10, LINC, ARCS, NORM, CVX. And these are just the ones in the RCTC. So in our common value sets, in addition to these, we also have codes from CPT and certain HL7 code systems as well. Okay, so we just talked about the RCTC and how, it doesn't include everything, like doesn't include the common value sets. But in VSAC, you can find all the value sets. So this slide shows a screenshot of VSAC. It's the Value Set Authority Center. It's an NLM tool, National Library of Medicine tool for managing and building value sets. And that's what the RCKMS content team maintains our value sets within VSAC. And we also publish our value sets in VSAC with every content release. The published value sets are available to view here to anybody. You just have to filter by the CSTE steward. You can see all of them. You can filter by an OID if you have that, a keyword. So it's pretty easy to use. You do have to have a login. Logins are free. We have a lot of documentation about how to do that. If you're interested, I can point you in the right direction there. It's in the RCKMS content repository, but everything is published here in VSAC for RCKMS content. And then my last slide before I pass it over to Anne, just want to talk about a few RCKMS value set constraints. So the first being the HL7 EICR implementation guide. It's the building block for RCKMS and our value sets, and our value sets correspond to coded data elements and the standard code systems that are specified within that IG. So, we're constrained to that, of course. The second is code system limitations. So as we just saw, we create our value sets and maintain them in VSAC. And so we're limited to the types of code systems available in VSAC. And we have run into some limitations there in the past. And then the content of the value sets is also dependent on the availability of codes needed to operationalize the reporting criteria. We oftentimes have a reporting criteria that we add, and there are no codes available to represent it. And so we keep checking for it in releases, but a lot of times they're not implementable. And finally, RCKMS tool implementation considerations. Just to note that, value sets are frequently enhanced. The RCKMS tool is frequently enhanced, and as new functionality becomes available in the tool to support additional data elements, we build new value sets to try to align as well. I think that one's my last one. Yep, I'm gonna pass it back to Anne.
Perfect. Thanks, Natalie. We're gonna do a little more life cycle with some of the codes here. So Natalie has mentioned the trigger codes, and so again, those trigger codes are in the RCTC that are implemented within the EHR system for a healthcare organization. Those codes again are specific, and they're what send the EICR to RCKMS to look for a reportable condition. And as Natalie has mentioned, there are different code sets available for this: SNOMED, LOINC, ICD, RX, and CVX. These codes also show up within an EICR itself, so they're searchable if you're looking for why a document was triggered. You can find one or many of those codes depending on the visit itself. And then once that EICR goes to RCKMS, the rules are run against it by jurisdiction and then by what they have authored as reportable and in production for them. And once that happens and there's something found reportable, those are given a condition code, and that condition code goes in that reportability response, or the RR. And those are normally SNOMED-based codes. And this is really to help with telling both the healthcare organization as well as the public health agency why the document was sent on and like which condition was met for. And if we take it one step further, the condition codes are usually what people try to map into their surveillance system for which reportable disease, so they can do their case investigation and then do their reporting for CDC through NNDSS. And so the NNDSS codes or the event codes are different than the condition codes. So there's a lot of codes floating around that kind of need to be cross-mapped, but it's kind of the life cycle of how a case report goes through. So next slide, Natalie. So to hit home, one of the things we run into a lot with ECR is knowing the difference between triggering and rules. And so Natalie hit a lot of these already, but again, the triggers are within a healthcare organization's EHR system. They're permanent, so they have to be defined within the implementation guide. And then the triggers are specific, as Natalie had mentioned. We can't trigger on pregnancy because it would be an insane amount of volume that would come through. But then when the rules come into place, applied at RCKMS, you can include those common rule sets along with the trigger codes, and those then can be authored by the jurisdiction to meet their needs. And of course, those are always broader, can include broader criteria, as Natalie mentioned, age, symptoms, et cetera, to meet those common codes. So we'll hit the next slide. Okay, so I thought this was interesting just to point out. So one of the things with the implementation guide for EICR is that we have a lot of centers on the 1.1 version, which has been around since, I want to say 2018, 2016 maybe. And the 3.1 was supposed to be being enforced to be kind of by EHRs implemented by the end of this year. Enforcement has been kind of pushed back another year, but in doing so, Natalie talked about the RCTC and different trigger codes that were available in there, including vaccination triggers or medication triggers. And what you'll actually notice if you look in the clinical medication column, those trigger templates as part of the implementation guide were not added until after 1.1. So while they were available in the RCTC, they could not be utilized at the healthcare organization as a trigger until this new version has come out. So a lot of changes that have occurred and hopefully will make things better and more full of a picture too. Next slide, please. Okay, I love data, so I pulled out some slides from a previous presentation. We were looking at the number of trigger codes to reportability related to the top 100 trigger codes that were being sent to APHL. What you'll notice is, and again, so you aren't seeing a lot of those CVX codes in here because they weren't triggering during 1.1 when this analysis was done, but 82% of the trigger codes are actually LOINC codes, followed by 16% for SNOMED, and then the 2% for ICD-10-CM. And then one of the things that maybe isn't always clear is that what disease or condition that is being triggered doesn't necessarily meet what is being reported to the public health agency. So you could trigger on a COVID ordered test, and something else within the patient's visit or chart indicates a different disease that needs to be reported to public health. So this right side here is showing kind of which reportable triggers were most likely to meet their reporting criteria. So the top one is a SARS RNA or COVID, essentially RNA test. About 38% of the time met the reporting criteria for COVID. As you'll notice, most of these are infectious disease, which isn't that surprising, but we do see that Parkinson's is one of our non-infectious diseases, and RCKMS does actually have about a 8.5% match rate, which is pretty cool. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the last thing I just wanted to touch on is, RCKMS is great, but as similar to what Natalie is talking about with constraints, there are some common issues we get within the system. And so I'm just going to hit on a couple of the ones that we are aware of. So next slide, please. One of the things that RCKMS has to do, it won't run all the rules that every jurisdiction has authored against an EICR that comes in. It will look specifically for the facility and the patient's jurisdiction. So anytime there's an invalid state or even zip code, because we do have counties, tribes, cities that are within using RCKMS, it's not going to match. And so there are some issues that we run into here. The implementation guide lists it as a should contain state with a value set, but doesn't require that value set. So if the state gets spelled out, as in Utah, it won't match to a jurisdiction and therefore won't be found reportable. Similarly, if you're missing the state or the zip code, it won't match. So there are some questions we get there about, why didn't I get this report to come through? And usually it has to do with the patient's address not matching. Next slide, please. Historical information. Charts, are not always clean. Doctors don't like to take off other doctors' notes or active problems for example. So we run into a lot of issues related to historical information. Problems lists with unresolved problems in them. So a problem left on a patient's chart for decades can meet reporting criteria. And the way around that right now within RCKMS is they've implemented something called time boxing. So they'll look at when the problem was added, and if it is outside of that window, it won't find it reportable. But if it's within the window timeframe that the public health agency has identified, it will send it as a reportable. Long patient encounters with repeated testing. So when I was at a jurisdiction, we'd run into this frequently, that if a patient was hospitalized for months and they had repeated COVID tests done during that time frame, if the first COVID test they had done at the beginning of their stay was positive, any new trigger and anytime that EICR got sent as an update, it would still be found reportable for COVID, even though we knew the patient had COVID 3 months ago. There is not necessarily a solution to this in place for right now, so it is still somewhat of an issue, but long encounters is a much smaller percentage of the EICRs that do come through, so hopefully it's somewhat manageable. And then lastly, lab orders. So one of the reporting criteria specifications for about 32 of the conditions in RCKMS allow you to report based off of a lab being ordered. These are mainly, anthrax or other scary based diseases that people would want to know upon order. The rule logic here will keep sending it to you even if it's been resulted, because it's not looking for the lab and the result for this particular specification. It's just looking that there was a lab ordered. So during the measles outbreak, we were getting a number of people who were reporting that they just kept getting updates on a patient's order, even though the results had previously come back. Next slide, please. All right, I think I have 2 more and then I'll stop chatting. Results, so laboratory information within an EHR system tends to cause some issues. This one is related to the result organizer level not being coded with LOINC or using local codes in the translation, because as Natalie has mentioned, we have to use standard codes. RCKMS then can't process it as reportable or not reportable because the codes are missing. So in the bottom XML screenshot, you can see that there's a translation code and the code up top has a null flavor of other. So it's just kind of missing a code. And next slide, please. Okay, result observation. So we also seem to have some issues with the result observation codes within a panel are often not LOINC coded and then cannot be processed by RCKMS. So there is what ends up happening is, you have a panel test that gets ordered. The app that the ECR Now Fire app will move that panel test if there's no test LOINC code associated at the individual level. So say you have a chlamydia and gonorrhea test, which I know is not necessarily a panel, but your order test will say it's a combo. And then underneath it, it will just keep that same combo. And then you're not really sure what is positive because it will just say positive for the test. Next slide, please. Perfect. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Are there questions?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, and I was curious, you had mentioned like 85% of these triggers are from LOINC codes, right? So a lot of the LOINC codes are simply, ordered, if I can just use an example, like potassium and plasma, right? So in your case, you were talking about GC and chlamydia. So just because you order a test doesn't mean it's positive or negative. So I'm curious I see you both shaking your head. So I'm curious how you're able to generate, a report based on a LOINC when you don't have the result, whether it's a text or, it seems like a positive or negative would be more tied to a SNOMED code, or if it's a certain threshold. So, which would be numeric, perhaps. So, how are you using that high of a percentage of LOINCs for reporting?
I saw you switching slides, Natalie, so I'm gonna let you take the first stab.
Yeah, I mean, I know that question was for Anne, but I do just want to point out. So in the example that I walked through with the logic, I just made it simple and did a diagnosis, which are pretty, straightforward. But if you look
Right.
directly under that, you'll see in item 2 there, logic rule 2 is for that's a lab test, right? And so
Right.
we've got the patient has a lab result with test name of Hep A test for Hep A virus IgM antibody. That would be like the codes in there are triggers. And then to be found reportable, they would have to be associated also and have the lab result value of either present or positive. Maybe they have a Hep A organism or substance code. Probably they shouldn't, but they might. We know how lab coding goes.
Right.
And or a result interpretation that's an abnormal value. So they have to be linked together. You have to have the trigger code just triggers it to get sent to RCKMS for evaluation. And then at RCKMS, we're going to evaluate it based on these rules. And if it's positive, basically, that's when it'll get sent and deemed reportable.
Okay, so it's more of an algorithm based. It's not just a LOINC code.
Yeah, the LOINC code just triggers it to send for evaluation. And then
Gotcha.
at RCKMS, Ames will evaluate it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
The other piece to add to that is there are only 32 reportable conditions that have lab orders reportable. And so that section of the RCTC, those are the only ones that should be triggering a lab order on its own. Obviously, there are lab resulted, or once the lab section contains more information, those ones can trigger as well, which then runs through those rule logics that Natalie was talking about.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Other questions? If not, I have a couple.
There you go.
So you said that the value sets are managed in VSAC, but you said the RCTCs are only available through the special
Mhm.
ESRD, ERSD. I can never remember the acronym. It's a lowercase e and then three letters. Yeah, there you go. Um, and but are you maintaining those value sets for the trigger codes also in VSAC?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So each value set gets maintained individually in VSAC, and then they kind of get combined. And I would like to tell you that it's like super automatic and
Yeah,
press
no,
the
probably
button or
not.
something. Of course, it's not.
No, no, in
Um,
VSAC, yeah.
yeah. So there's a lot of manual putting those together into the RCTC, and then that gets kind of shipped off to be included in the ERSD, right? And does that?
Yeah, it's actually
Yeah.
like happening now in real time. There's supposed to be a release, I think, later this week, as long as everything stays on schedule for the ERSD. They usually try to do, like as Natalie is saying, they update the um, value sets, and it may be because there's a new conditioner, there's more lab tests available. And so when those get released within RCKMS, they want the ERSD release. So the triggers are updated right around the same time the RCKMS is updated.
Right, that makes sense, and you probably need to update those when Loin comes out with new stuff or Snowman comes out with new stuff that's applicable. So yeah, that makes total sense. So my question is there any talk about making those value sets also accessible to people that use VSAC for other meaningful use things and download them from there rather than making people go to the ERSD spot?
I'm not sure for the RCTC if there's plans on that. I know they're talking about moving to more of like a API connection, but I think some of that's kind of already built in with a JSON in the ERSD. Um, so it would be nice if they were more out there, but the account for an ERSD is free. So it's easy enough to get an
I
account
know,
and
it's just,
download
I've
their
been
stuff.
asked a couple times at
Mhm.
HL7, why can't we just get those value sets at the same place we get all the other value sets we need for meaningful use? So I'm like, I thought I'd ask. So
Yeah.
It would be nice. I think the answer is always that this ECR project seems to be weirdly special. So it does things differently.
And I don't know, I don't even have an ERSD account. I don't know if I should put that here on a recorded video, but I don't. I don't even know, and like, because we do have the codes in a spreadsheet, and that's one of the ways we deliver it to the ERSD. Is it also downloadable via spreadsheet via
yeah,
ERSD? Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
yeah, you get the spreadsheet or you can get it as a JSON
Okay.
format. Yeah, I've seen both.
Yeah.
So
But it is one more place you have to go to get it.
yeah,
Hmm.
that was the other question I was asked. I thought I'd ask. Uh, any other questions?